Well, Mr. Arnup,
I see a red dot.
that's good. That's a good sign. That means we're videoing and you're looking fine. You were a lawyer for almost 4 decades, and I wonder if you remember the first day that you began in articling. I'm interested here in the physical context of being a lawyer. I know you took the streetcar. I'm pretty sure that you took the streetcar that first day to work. And I wonder if you can take it when you got off the streetcar and tell me what your impressions were of your office, who was in the building, what you were thinking about, what you could see and hear.
My firm, where I became a student in 1932, occupied the 10th floor of the Sterling Tower, which was a fairly new building. The firm had been over on Toronto Street for some time, and there were a number of law firms in a building on Toronto Street, and 2 or 3 small firms of 2 and 3 lawyers occupied various floors of the Sterling Tower, although I think my firm was the first tenant there. J.C. McClure's firm were down on the 5th or 6th floors, and there were a number of lawyers on the 3rd floor of the building as well. But one of the striking differences between law firms in 1935, when I was called to the bar, and subsequent years, was in the number of lawyers in individual firms. Our firm had 9 lawyers, and when I was called to the bar, I became the 10th. And for a number of years, that's how many lawyers were in the firm, because that's how many rooms we had on the 10th floor. Eventually, we rented a 2-room suite in the floor above us and had 2 lawyers up there who constantly had to climb the stairs or come down the stairs to see one of the more senior members of the firm. Our firm was about the same size and similar in many ways to the Fasken firm, which had been founded by Alec Fasken, and his brother David had been one of the early members of the firm as well. Both our firm and the Fasken firm had 5 names in the firm name, and this was common in 1935 and has now become quite uncommon as firms one by one have changed their firm name to something shorter. Our firm was Mason, Folds, Davidson, Carter, and Kellogg. The Fasken firm was Fasken, Robertson, Aitchison, Pickup, and Calvin. And it was a formidable group of lawyers. And not infrequently, someone from their firm was on the other side of cases in which someone from our firm was to be found. Mason Folds was known as primarily a litigation firm, and the Fasken firm had some very good litigators as well, led by R.S. Robertson, whom I've mentioned earlier
Yes.
in other parts of my memoirs. But J.W. Pickup was a good court lawyer. Like Robertson, he later became Chief Justice of Ontario. Mr. Calvin was an excellent lawyer, and on rare occasions he appeared in court also. The largest firm was the Blake firm, and when I first became acquainted with Toronto firms, it was Blake, Lash, Anglin, and Castles. Mr. Lash left that firm when his two sons had been called to the bar and formed a small firm in which his two sons were associated with him. The name of Anglin was one of highly respected in the legal profession in Toronto. He died, but one of his sons continued to practice in the firm, but he was not the Anglin whose name was there. The name Castles is very well known in the lore of Toronto lawyers. Some of them were related, others had that name, but the connection by way of family was very remote and went back to the 19th century.
Was this the Hamilton Castles that we've previously spoken of?
Hamilton Castles was a member of the firm which originally was Castles, Brock, and Kelly. The name Castles is still the #1 name in what has now become quite a large firm. The second name in the current firm of Castles Blackwell has acquired the name of Leslie Blackwell, who was a conservative attorney general under Leslie Frost's premiership. One interesting thing about the way in which the profession developed in Ontario was that from quite early days, about half the lawyers in Ontario practiced in Toronto, and about half out of Toronto. And this continued for a very long time, and I think, give or take a few hundred, exists today.
Mhm.
That division made itself apparent in the election of benchers, because for many elections, almost half of the benchers, which were originally 30 in number, came from metropolitan Toronto and half from outside. This pattern was finally broken in an election in which 17 benchers were elected from the metropolitan area, which did not have that name in the period that I'm thinking of. And that disparity resulted eventually in a fixed number equal to half of the benchers, including when the overall number rose to 40. But the pattern was broadened also to have benchers represent electoral districts, 8 in all, the same division of districts as had been established for the courts of Ontario when the merger between the county and district courts on the one hand and the Supreme Court of Ontario on the other took place under Ian Scott as Attorney General.
When you were a young lawyer, I know that you traveled to a number of these districts, and I've read your article about Walkerton courts, and I know you went up to Sudbury. Did you go to other county towns?
Yes, I had a number of cases in Hamilton, and much to the discontent of the Hamilton bar, Mason Folds acted for the city of Hamilton, primarily because of relationship between the city solicitor, whose name was A.J. Polson, P-O-L-S-O-N, and that relationship continued for a long time through retainer of myself and Jack Weir, and in one case the two of us were in the same case acting for the city.
Now, was that the one about the store closing bylaws in the 1960s? I know I read about that in the newspaper.
I don't remember much about the case, except that the plaintiff operated one or more gas stations and had hired Mr. Arthur Slatt from Toronto. Slatt was a very prominent lawyer, partly in the civil side and partly in the criminal side. He was another of the Toronto lawyers who was not noted for the time he spent in preparation. He was noted for some of the company he kept.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
Which, when he ran into Toronto lawyers, or whom, when he introduced as being his niece.
Oh, he had a large family?
But going back to the Arnup travels,
Yes.
I have done cases in London, quite a number in London, a few in Windsor. I've done cases in North Bay, but I used to say that I never got north of North Bay because that took you into Greg Evans' country, and Greg was always on one side or the other of litigation across the North Country. He practiced out of Timmins. But I have been to Chatham, a number of cases in Belleville, one or two in Whitby,
Stratford?
one in Kingston that I remember well, where I was hired in a federal prosecution to act as junior for a local lawyer with John Robinette on the other side, and the local lawyer botched the case, and I was retained. I had originally been the junior counsel. I was rehired to take the case on appeal, which I did and won it on appeal.
Against Robinette?
Against Robinette, yes.
When was that?
This was a wartime prices and
yes.
trade board case when the board prosecuted Black Diamond Cheese Company, who always maintained that theirs was a premium cheese for which they were entitled to charge a premium price. And cheese was one of the many products which had a fixed price under the Wartime Prices and Trade Board regulations. The case has some interesting aspects, but not in the subject that we're dealing with today.
But cheese is always interesting. What was the federal government saying? That it wasn't a argument, that it was not a premium cheese, or what was your position?
The federal government's position was that all cheese was the same. Then I did a number of cases in Ottawa, not before the Supreme Court. I put those in a separate category.
Yes.
Out of sheer curiosity, I once added up the number of cases that I had done on the Supreme Court of Canada and found the number was 53. And some of my bencher friends who have a practice in the Supreme Court of Canada find that an incredible number, until I remind them that during my early years at the bar, you could appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada in any case where there was $2,000 involved. That changed twice while I was still at the bar, and now, of course, you require leave of the court to bring any appeal, civil or criminal.
Yes.
There were some counties that I never got to, but I shouldn't leave out Milton. I did a number of cases in Milton. I did one or two in Brockville. I did one, I think, in Cornwall.
Now, were many of these because you were a special prosecutor after the war?
No.
How did you get, for instance, to Milton or Brockville?
Apart from the cheese company in Belleville,
Mm-hmm.
most of the prosecution work that I did was done in Toronto. The cases in these various other places were all civil cases. Mr. Mason had acted in a number of cases in which what was then called the Workmen's Compensation Board sued alleged wrongdoers under their subrogated rights. The board was paying compensation, but was subrogated to all the rights of the workmen. And when Mr. Mason retired, I inherited that practice, and eventually most of those cases were done by Mac Austin in my office, but under my very loose supervision.
And these were heard at county courts, these cases?
I did a number of appeals in the county court,
Mm-hmm.
but immediately after the war, and I've touched on this in an earlier episode, I became a popular counsel in landlord and tenant cases
Yes.
because of my wartime job that led to familiarity with the law of landlord and tenant. And those cases were heard by county court judges. And I pause here to tell a little story as an aside. The senior judge in the county of York was a judge named James Parker, who had a practice of people of some means. And I think there is no doubt that he had a bias in favor of landlords. But a number of cases were taken by myself and others where a landlord had been successful before him, and then there was an appeal. So it came to my attention that Parker had developed a habit of saying to the court reporter, "Don't take this down," and he would then make some comment about the case. And that way the comment never got to the Court of Appeal,
Mm-hmm.
but was a revelation of some bias, in my opinion, and that of others. So in one particular case, I spoke to the court reporter before court opened and said, "The judge is going to say to you, don't take this down. You're sworn to take everything down, and I want you to take everything down, including what he says about don't take it down." Sure enough, Parker, when we were well into the case, said to the reporter, "Don't take this down." and made a comment or two, and I subsequently appealed, and the Court of Appeal didn't mention that particular episode, which of course I drew to their attention. But they, in that way, became aware of the fact that Parker, I think unintentionally, had a bias in favor of landlords, because during his practice before he became a judge, he would have 10 cases involving the landlord to every one that he had involving tenants. That was the nature of his practice.
You made things sticky for that court reporter, maybe, did you?
Well, experienced counsel with a big practice in the courts got pretty friendly with all court reporters, because they could do you favors, such as at a recess reading back to you some key parts of the evidence.
And that was a favor as opposed to their job?
Yes. I don't think anybody ever got around to deciding whether this was part of their job or not part of their job.
Mm-hmm.
And they would do it at a recess for people that they respected and who had been nice to them.
Was there one court reporter for each court, generally?
No, not for each court, for each judge.
For each judge.
And the reporter traveled with the judge
I see.
frequently by train and stayed in the same hotel.
So that was quite a close relationship then.
Yes, it was. And a number of those relationships were very close. They would involve cases where the judge was a likable person and so was the court reporter. And since they were thrown together anyway, being friendly was easy
Mm-hmm.
for them on either side.
Which court reporters do you remember most clearly, or that you struck up a good relationship with?
Well, the one I remember best became eventually the senior reporter. They had an association of their own, professional association. His name was Noel Dixon, Noel, Dixon, Dickson. And for a number of years, he traveled with Mr. Justice Barlow, which was not a particularly friendly relationship. But when McClure became Chief Justice, he knew about Noel Dixon, who was a very good reporter, and he lifted him off Barlow's list, and thereafter Noel Dixon traveled with McClure, which I think posed a bit of a challenge to Dixon on a number of occasions. But
Would you like to
one
elaborate?
reporter whose name I can't now come up with, because he later left the Supreme Court and was working for the Ontario Municipal Board. But he was a good friend of mine, but he was traveling with one of the judges who was not a close friend, not a close friend with anybody that I knew about.
Who was that?
And I won't tell you. But on one famous case, there was a bit of a row in open court, the nature of which has passed into history as far as I'm concerned. But the reporter got fed up, threw down his pen and walked out.
Really?
And of course the case immediately ground to a halt because you couldn't operate without a reporter. But they had a reconciliation later on. But the word that this had happened passed into court lore fairly rapidly, and most of the lawyers and all of the reporters were on the side of the man who walked out.
Now, when you went to these towns, would you go in and out of country lawyers' offices? Would you be visiting lawyers in their offices, or would you mostly see them in the courtroom and surrounds, courts, house?
Oh no, there was a good deal of visiting from one office to another, even on the litigation group.
Would their offices be very different in appearance or facilities to your office on Toronto Street, or Bay Street, I should say?
No, in the 1940s and well into the 1950s, the law offices in large part were still feeling the effects of the Depression, which not only in the legal business but in other businesses did not end in 1935, as some people seem to think. Its effect was felt for years after the Depression technically was finished. And one of the obvious proofs of that was that very few lawyers went in for elaborate furniture or waiting rooms with expensive rugs the way they do nowadays.
Can you describe your office when you first got one of those 10 offices?
The best short description is bare bones. My first office had room for, I think, only one picture.
What was it?
It was an etching by a very well-known artist in the field of etching, whose stuff later became quite sought after, but who in 1935 or 6 actually went through the Sterling Tower from office to office peddling his own etchings.
Really?
For something like $25 a piece.
Do you remember who that was?
No, but he was well known in the 30s and 40s.
So you bought an etching and you hung it on your wall, And what else did you have in your office?
A desk and 2 or 3 plain office type chairs, including one that was a little better, that I used it for my own chair, but still reasonably simple in design and construction.
And a telephone on your desk?
Yes. When the firm was on Toronto Street, there was only one telephone in the office, and it was on the counter at the front of the office. And the reason that I learned that, because of course I was never in the Toronto office, there was a picture of Mr. Mason sitting at a desk with the upright rotary dial telephone style sitting on a corner of his desk.
Did you have a switchboard operator on Bay Street?
Yes. A very valuable one. If she liked you. She'd been there quite a long time.
What was her name? Do you remember?
Wallace.
A
Miss
famous.
Wallace. An Irish Catholic, very devout person. And one feature of our day-to-day practice, which was also a feature in 2 or 3 other offices, we had what was called a copy book, consisting of 100 pages or so that were almost like tissue paper. And the typewriters had indelible ink, and you made copies of letters by using, first of all, the indelible ink type. Then it went in this book with a moist blotter, and that produced a copy with the assistance of a iron plate that screwed down to bring pressure to bear on the book. And because my firm had been in existence for a long time, about which I'll make some comment in a moment, we had a couple of hundred of copybooks in the storage room. And one of the jobs of the switchboard operator each day was to index alphabetically by recipient the outgoing letters in an index at the front of the copybooks, which were called copybooks.
So Miss Wallace had several jobs then.
Yes, she also had an assistant, a young girl, whose job was to put stamps on outgoing letters and from time to time be the girl who made copies of letters in the copybook.
So you would write out something in longhand, and for instance, a letter to a client, and then what would happen? Or perhaps you didn't. Did someone else
I
write
don't
it?
understand the reference to longhand.
Did you use a typewriter?
Well, I shared a secretary.
I see. Where would it was a she?
We had a large room with the secretaries sitting one behind each other in a row, so to speak. And the junior members of the firm normally shared the services of a secretary. Mr. Mason had his own secretary, and one of the other senior partners had his own secretary.
But they would all share this one room.
All the secretaries were in this one room. When I left the Wartime Prices and Trade Board to go back to practice, I had at the board a very efficient young woman, and I persuaded her, because the board was winding down,
Yes.
to become my secretary at Mason Holes, which she did. She regarded the secretarial arrangements as pretty primitive, and after a year or so, despite the fact that she had great respect and indeed affection for me, she decided she wanted to work in a place where the amenities for secretaries were better, and she left.
Such as a separate office for her? Is that what she expected, or?
Well, I think she expected an office where there were fewer than 10 secretaries.
Must have been a very noisy place, was it?
I would think so. In fact, I know so, because we had occasion to walk back there from time to time.
So when you saw clients, where did you see clients?
Well, that's one of the big changes that has taken place in the last 15 years. We saw clients in our own office. The only shared office was the library. When I say shared, all the lawyers went to the library, which was entirely in one room. But nowadays, the practice has developed of lawyers having relatively small rooms, and they'll be, depending on the size of the firm, 3 or 4 conference rooms, ranging from those that would seat 8 people to a boardroom size, which might seat as many as 20 people around the table. And when my firm moved from the Sterling Tower to the Bank of Canada building at the corner of Queen and University, one of the things that we acquired was a boardroom.
About when was that move?
About 1957 or 1958, somewhere in there. I was, as my name wasn't in the firm at the time of the move, but I was very senior. So I did a minimum of work in connection with the move. And the move was over a weekend, and on Monday morning I went into my new office.
So what did it look like?
Yes. But nowadays, firms of any size have relatively small offices for individual lawyers with maybe 3 chairs, maybe a table in the corner, a small table. But board rooms, the current Weir Folds firm, the successor to my old firm, has 4 boardrooms named after former partners, including me, and those 4 would probably seat 8 people, but then they have a large boardroom at which, for example, they can have a partnership meeting with 38 or 40 lawyers sitting around one table. And virtually all firms of any size have a boardroom large enough to accommodate a lot of people.
So in your firm in the 50s, or in the old building on Bay Street, where would you have partnership meetings? Or
in the Sterling Tower, we had them in the office of the man who really was the office manager, though nowadays we would call him the managing partner.
Mr. Davidson, was that?
Mr. Davidson.
So he had the biggest office in the firm, did he?
No, Mr. Mason had the biggest office, which was in the corner overlooking both the City Hall and Bay Street.
Was it more luxurious, Mr. Mason's office, than yours?
It was very plainly furnished, and when he was getting on in years, he had a couch installed where he could take a noon-hour nap. But apart from that, his office was no different than the rest of us, with a desk, a chair for the lawyer chosen by him, a little special, and 3 or 4 other chairs.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about your office then in 1958? How did it change? How had it changed?
Well, from my point of view, it changed because I had a considerably larger office. Jack Weir and I had the 2 corner offices. Mine was in the northeast corner, looking towards the City Hall.
What floor were you on?
The 4th floor there. The building only had 7 floors,
Mm-hmm.
and the Borden firm, then having 4 or 5 names led by Borden Elliott, we're on the top floor, and the Day Wilson firm, we're on the 6th floor, as I recall it. And the first 3 floors were occupied by government organizations, the Bank of Canada on the first and second floors, and the Development Bank was on the third floor, and some other governmental organization.
So you had a nice view from your office. Did you still have the etching?
Do I still have what?
The etching from your original office, your first office decoration, your painting?
Oh, I think I was up to 3 or 4 pictures by that time.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go in for photographs, and I didn't go in for large pictures, but mostly pretty routine stuff.
Did you have a little bar for clients?
No. But we still had a large room for secretaries,
Mm-hmm.
whereas nowadays a lot of secretaries have an interior office close to the lawyer that they worked for.
Yes. Who was your secretary in that period?
Well, my first secretary, I shared with Archie Foles. Her name was KFOX, and she stayed with the firm until she reached retirement age. A very fine person. Was about 5'10" in height. Then when I got my own unshared secretary, she was about 5'1", but a nice young woman.
Did she stay with you a long time?
Yes.
What was her name?
Don't recall now what she eventually did. I think she got married and started to raise a family.
Mm-hmm.
But she was succeeded by a woman named Elsie Swartz, who was my secretary for at least 10 years in the Bank of Canada building, and a very talented woman, unmarried. And on a number of occasions when I was seeing a new client on a fairly complicated matter, I would have her come in and sit in the corner and take notes, which eased my note-taking. I was free to sit there and ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
When I left to go to the Court of Appeal, she worked about 1 more year at what had become Weir and Folds at that time. And she became the first head of secretarial services at Humber College.
Really?
And she was the author of a couple of books used in the course, not only by her, but by other people involved in their secretarial course, which was a very popular course and quite extensive.
Mm-hmm.
And she held that job until she finally retired.
Did she take notes in shorthand, or
Yes.
could you read shorthand?
No.
So she would convert them for you. When did you first get a business card? that you would hand out?
Well, the question assumes something to which the answer may surprise you. I never had a business card.
Never.
I had what in those days was called a calling card,
A calling card.
an engraved card with nothing on it but my name.
Not even a phone number.
No, no. If I was going to give a new client a card, I gave him a calling card and wrote the phone number on the back.
Mm-hmm. I realize this relates in some ways to the concerns and bans on advertising. Or how long did you keep a calling card with nothing on it except your name?
Apart from changing it when I became a judge,
Yes.
and then changing it again when I became the Honorable somebody and the Order of Canada,
Yes.
I changed the card, but again, it's all on one line.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I have one in my wallet now.
Was that common to have a calling card instead of a business card?
To tell you the truth, I don't know. I don't know what other people did, and I didn't care.
No. That might be a good note to end on, unless you would like to speak on something else. Mr. Arnup, we've got about 3 minutes left on the tape.
Well, I think I may have told this story before, but
Not on tape.
true. In 1970, McCarthy and McCarthy decided to move to the Toronto Dominion Centre. So they had 3/4 of a floor in the Canada Life building, who was their biggest client, certainly one of their biggest clients. And we were expanding also. So we entered into negotiations to take over their space in the Canada Life building. And I, as the senior partner by this time, went up to see the space to choose my own office. And I chose the office which had been occupied by Senator Hayden, who was, by that time, the senior man at McCarthy's. And it was in the northeast corner with a view straight up University Avenue that I had before
Yes.
in the Bank of Canada. So I chose that corner, and Jack Weir chose the northwest corner, which was very similar in size to the room I had picked out. I never moved into my chosen room because I got appointed to the Court of Appeal. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember if I ever knew who did move into the room I had chosen. It was certainly the prime room in the space. But the firm continued to grow and eventually moved out of the Bank of Canada, or the Canada Life accommodation, into the Exchange Tower, where they took 3 floors and continued, of course, to expand, with numbers varying from 65 to 80.
I think we have to stop there, Mr. Arnup.